They're not going to remember everything you said. They will remember how they felt. And so I think if you can move them emotionally, laughter and tears, they're going to retain a lot more of the information because you did move them emotionally.
So, a couple months ago, I saw this gentleman, his name is Frank King, speak at an event that I went to, a Dental Speakers Institute event. Frank King is a suicide prevention speaker and a comedian. I know, crazy combination. He is infectious, he is effective, he is hysterical and makes you feel uncomfortable and makes you feel aware. He does all of those things. What I love about Frank is that he shows up every time in a true, authentic, and vulnerable way. He is doing what he is set out to do, which is to start this conversation about suicide, to bring awareness to suicide ideation, to depression, to mental illness and mental health concerns in the medical and dental professions, and beyond. He speaks to this so eloquently and so vulnerably and shares his own story and his own struggles with mental health. In this episode, you can expect some uncomfortable humor. And I ask him how levity helps to support sharing and making this conversation more comfortable. Why is it that levity seems to be that one comfortable, convenient way for us all to understand one another? What is it about levity that breaks down our barriers? He also shares his story of near death experiences in suicide several times in his life. And what is suicide ideation in terms of a perpetual mental health risk? This is such an important conversation, one very close and dear to my heart, but one that is such an important conversation to keep having. This is one of those episodes that shares with us resources, opportunities to find support for yourself, and also reminding us that we need to have these uncomfortable conversations. We need to let people know that they're not alone and that there are resources, and that when we start this conversation, we might just save a life. Join me in welcoming Frank King. Hello, and welcome to the Business of Happiness. I'm your host, Dr. Tarryn MacCarthy, and today we have with us the one and only Frank King from his mobile unit. Welcome, Frank.
Yeah,
You
well,
are speaking to me from in front of some bars, Frank. Tell us where you are right now.
a little grill. Yeah, I'm in it's our dog car. Anybody who has a dog of any size knows a dog car. Somebody said, "Where'd your back seats go?" It's been so long we ripped them out. I can't tell you. I have no idea. In a dump somewhere. I just dropped the dogs off at doggy daycare. It's their spa day, and they love it so much. When I let them out of the car, they never even look back. They just dash
Aw.
in.
So these are your canine fellow friends and your partners in crime here. So
Yep.
you're calling us from your car. What is this part of your day job?
Well, actually, Mondays I got used to during the pandemic, the heart of the pandemic, doing all my errands on one day, grouping it all. And we live about 25 minutes outside of town, so I'd hit the Walgreens, the grocery store, the Costco, whatever on Mondays. Just got in the habit of doing that. And I'm sitting in front of the AT&T store. I'm about to trade in my 8 Plus iPhone for a 13 Pro Max.
Awesome. And then tell us what you do in your other world, Frank. This is what we're here to talk to you about. I want to hear all the news because you have a fascinating background of some levity and comedy and some really dark, deep places. So share us a little bit of your journey.
Well, I told my first joke in fourth grade. The kids laughed. The teacher was so hysterical she had to leave the room, go to the teacher's lounge, and that at that moment I decided I'm going to be a stand-up comedian. In 12th grade, they had a talent show. Nobody had ever done stand-up before. I'd taken 3 years of drama, never got a good part in any play, and I thought to myself, you know what? If I do stand-up, I can write, direct, produce, and star in my own little show every night. And so I did stand-up. I won the talent show. I told my mama, I'm going to be a comedian. And she said, and I quote, son, you're going to college first. I don't care what you do when you get done. You can be a goat herder for all I care, but you, son, will be a goat herder with a college degree. So I'm happy to report that I went to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, which they happened to be in the Sweet 16 in March Madness, and got a couple of degrees. Moved to San Diego, California, with my high school sweetheart, then soon to be wife, and not too long after that, first ex-wife. And there's a comedy store in San Diego, a branch of the one in LA. And so I went to open mic night. And there's a story. My fourth TEDx talk is called "Suicide: The Secret of My Success,"
Mm.
and that's my. I was married and miserable, although she's a lovely woman. Selling insurance, miserable. And I realized living with depression and thoughts of suicide that if I didn't make some changes and fast, sooner rather than later, I was going to kill myself. So my
Mm.
second thought was, well, I could get divorced, quit my job, try stand up comedy. If it works, great. If it doesn't, I can always kill myself.
Mm.
So that's how I got into comedy. And I've met another half dozen entrepreneurs since then who had the very same thought process. So I
Mm.
finally went to open mic night. I'm doing my first 5 minutes. Inside my head, I heard another voice. You're home. Whoa. Decided at that moment I was going to do it for a professional living. Didn't know how, but made up my mind that that's where I belonged. A year later, I said to my girlfriend, now my wife of 35 years, I said, I'm going on the road to do stand up. Do you want to come along for the ride? Figuring she'd go, oh, hell no. And she goes, yeah. So we were on the road. We gave up the apartment, our jobs, put everything in storage I couldn't fit into my tiny Dodge Colt. And we were on the road together for 2,629 nights in a row, nonstop, no home. Just 7 years and change, comedy club to comedy club. And worked with an amazing group of people who are now famous. Seinfeld, Dennis Miller, Foxworthy, Ron White, opened up for Lou Rawls, Randy Travis, the Beach Boys. It was a great time to be doing stand up. Then at the middle 90s, I got a job in radio in my old hometown, Raleigh, North Carolina. I got a job on the number one morning show in Raleigh, which in 18 months I drove to number six. And a friend of mine goes, you didn't just drive that into the ground, you drove it into Middle Earth. True. Got fired, as people are wont to do in radio. There are two kind of people in radio, Taryn. People who've been fired, people who are going to be fired. So I got
Okay.
fired. Yeah, and the comedy club boom had busted. And the good news was I was always very clean. My act was very clean. And so I made the jump to corporate comedy after dinner, after lunch, and made a good living for about 10 years in the corporate comedy space. And then the last recession hit, 2007, 8, 9, 10. And speaking dropped off 80% practically overnight. And so we lost everything in a Chapter 7 bankruptcy, everything we'd worked for in 20, 25 years.
Wow.
And that's when I learned what the barrel of my gun tasted like. Spoiler alert, I did not pull the trigger. That's one of the humorous things I say at my keynotes, and people laugh nervously, like, should we be laughing at this? Well, I
Yeah.
followed up with this. A friend of mine came to one of my keynotes recently, and he thought he'd be funny. He goes, hey, man, how come you didn't pull the trigger? I go, hey, man, could you try to sound slightly less disappointed? So I didn't pull the trigger. And then when the recession ended and people started meeting again, conferences, the meeting planner said to me, Frank, we love you dearly, but we can't pay you $5,000 for 45 minutes of just comedy. You have got to teach our audience something. So, and I'd always wanted to do that. I always wanted to make a living and a difference, but I could never figure out what I had to teach anybody. So I read a book by a woman named Judy Carter called The Message of You, Turning Your Life into a Money-Making Speaking Career.
Huh.
And Judy would say, yeah, Frank, it's great for comics because you can go from being a funny speaker to a speaker who's funny. And so I went into the book thinking I got nothing. And about halfway through, because she kind of walks you through the process to find your heart story, the one thing you'd really like to share with other people. And I realized about halfway through, I could speak on suicide prevention because of my close call, because it runs in my family. My grandmother died by suicide. My mother found her. My great aunt died by suicide. My mother and
Wow.
I found her. I was 4 years old. I screamed for days. Yeah, more nuts in my family than in a squirrel turd. And so I said to myself, if I get some certifications in suicide prevention, get trained, which I have, then I could keynote on suicide prevention. And that's what I began to do in 2012. And my second hurdle was not only from going from a funny speaker to a speaker who's funny, second hurdle was everybody thought of me as a comic.
Mm.
How do I convince them I can do something serious?
Mm.
So my wife suggested a TEDx talk, and I said famously, "What's a TEDx talk?" And by chance, I got an application and an email that week from a TEDx in Vancouver, British Columbia, and it was an application to apply. So I applied and I got it. And I did it, and I decided that I would, for the first time in my life, reveal that I live with major depressive disorder and chronic suicidal ideation. I came out on stage in the TED as depressed and suicidal. Nobody knew. My family, my friends, my wife, nobody knew. Matter of fact, when it
So
got,
all
came
this
time,
time in all your comedy routines, you weren't mentioning this.
no, nobody knew. Matter of fact, when it posted up on YouTube, I said to my wife before she hit play, look, before you watch the TED,
Mm.
I want to tell you half a dozen things you don't know about me that you're about to hear in my TEDx talk.
Wow.
Yep. So, and then I got invited to two more from that one. Two events called and said, "Do you have any other mental health topics?" Oh yeah. And then the next three I applied for and got. So I've got six of them, all on mental health, all on one aspect or another. And I'm applying for number seven right now. And it allowed me to rebrand. And every TED I did, enhanced my brand. And a friend of mine, I'll owe him for the rest of my life, when I decided to do the speaking on suicide prevention, said to me, "I've got an idea for you. I've got a name, a URL, a domain name you need to buy." And I said, "What is it?" He goes, "The Mental Health Comedian."
Mm.
And so I bought it, and that has become my brand. I am the mental health comedian. And if you go there, a two women and I are co-writing or have co-written a four-book series on men's mental health.
Wow.
And the first one, I did the narration. I'm going to narrate them all for Audible, but I got an MP3 copy. So if you go to my website, The Mental Health Comedian, you can download the unabridged first book free and get an idea what the series is like. And the other two women called me up and they said, "Would you make the book funny and would you add some automobile metaphors? Because it's made to look like an automobile owner's manual, figuring
Oh,
guys might
cool.
actually pick it up." And so I said, "Wait a minute. You two ladies are writing a book on men's mental health. Don't you think you might need, I don't know, a man?" And they went, "Oh my God, a man." So they made me co author, and I said, "I want to narrate them for Audible." They said, "Fine." So the fourth book comes out this April. The rest of them are on Amazon. And then thanks to the TEDx talks, I began to speak on suicide prevention. What I discovered was, even though one person dies by suicide in the US every 9 minutes,
Mm.
every 40 seconds around the world, hardly anybody talks about it unless you bring it up.
Mm.
And so my job, and I've been told this by client after client, we brought you in here simply to start the conversation on suicide because if you do, when I go on stage and I'm vulnerable and I share my story and I get choked up, it gives other people in the audience permission to give voice to their feelings and experiences
Mm.
without recrimination. So I tell my mental health speakers that I'm coaching, look, you do your 45 minutes, you do your 15 Q&A. You set aside another half an hour because there's going to be a line of people who
Mm.
want to chat with you afterwards, share a story, ask for advice, looking for resources, and that has been the case. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had that start like this. "Frank, I've never told anybody this." "Oh, really? I
Mm.
get that a lot." It happened this week. One of my TEDx coaching clients, I coach TEDx, said to me in passing, he mentioned he'd been suicidal, and I said, "Stop. You were suicidal?" He goes, "Oh yeah. Well, Frank, I've never told anybody this."
Mm.
I said, "Yeah, I get that a lot." Uh, so that's what really my job is because the I just did a show for a big construction company in downtown Manhattan. It's a 1,000-foot tall building. There were 1,000 construction workers. I did it on site, and the they brought me in because they've got a program, break the stigma. And the way you break the stigma is you start the conversation, break the silence, you break the stigma.
Mm.
And so that's my job. And in 2018, January 1st, I decided I would speak on nothing but suicide prevention. I mean, I still have a comedy set and a networking keynote, but I don't market those. I can use those as added value for a client, but I only market myself as a suicide prevention speaker. And I chose six of the top 10 at-risk occupations for suicide. And before we got on the air here, you mentioned two of them, dentists, physicians, I also do veterinarians, attorneys, construction, and agriculture. Those are 6 of the top 10 at-risk occupations, and it makes my marketing easier because I don't have to convince them
Mm.
they need help with suicide prevention. They know that already. They're just trying to decide which suicide prevention speaker they're going to bring in. And oftentimes I'll get the gig because I can leaven it with some well placed, organic, funny stories, personal stories about my mental health journey, not jokes, but personal, funny stories.
So,
And
what
so,
is the power of levity in talking about mental health and suicide? What is it that levity does?
well, there's a reason they call it comic relief. There's a psychological principle actually. If you have to tell somebody something very serious,
Hmm.
perhaps dark, if you do that and then you give them some comic relief, leaven it with a funny story, personal story, their brain is much more receptive to the next piece of serious, perhaps dark information. So it makes the suicide prevention keynote and the learning objectives that I teach makes it much more digestible and memorable. And I like to take them from tears I'm sorry, from laughter to tears and back. There's an expression in the speaking business. They're not going to remember everything you said. They will remember how they felt.
Mm.
And so I think if you can move them emotionally, laughter and tears, they're going to retain a lot more of the information because you did move them emotionally.
Yeah, and from an empowerment standpoint, I think that that's very empowering to experience that you can go from one deep emotion to another in a quick succession. So you don't feel like you have to be mired in something. There's something about experiencing deep sadness, tears, coming at it from laughter, and then coming back again, or vice versa, because it gives you a sense that nothing is so permanent. There doesn't have to be permanence in sadness or in depression, but that you can kind of move through it. It gives you a little bit of empowerment over it.
Yes, and I can do that I've done it in 10 minutes. I've made them laugh and made them cry and laugh again in 10 minutes.
Mm,
It's a challenge in 10 minutes, 45 minutes is much easier, but
mm,
yeah, so and my speaking, 25% of the people in the US, 25% of the people in the world have a mental challenge, roughly.
mm,
And so a lot of what I do is for them when I
mm,
speak.
mm,
And when I talk about putting my gun in my mouth, you can see the people with a mental challenge leaning in,
mm,
and you can see the neurotypicals leaning back like, oh, dear God.
mm.
And so, but I also have information for neurotypicals trying to decode what's going on in the brain of somebody living with a mental
Yeah.
challenge. People say to me, why would he want to kill himself? Well, the truth is, most people in a suicidal situation don't want to kill themselves. I didn't want to kill myself. They simply want to end the pain,
Mm,
which is a revelation to a lot of people who are neurotypical or neuronormal, that that's what's going on. It's not about wanting to die so much as it is simply wanting to end the pain. Same thing happens with drug and alcohol addiction or substance abuse disorder. You're trying to kill the pain, basically.
If you're listening to this podcast, chances are you didn't get into business to be miserable. The problem is that people feel that if their business gets busier, if they start becoming more successful, that happiness will eventually set in. But it can actually get worse. This is why I created the Business of Happiness Prosperity Coaching. In this one-on-one coaching, we look at how to redefine success on your terms and re-find the joy and the passion in your dream. Visit me at thebizofhappiness.com and become the happiest business owner you know. What has been something surprising that you've learned in meeting with all these people over the years? Has there been something that has surprised you about the human condition in terms of understanding or talking about suicide?
Yes, I have major depressive disorder, better known as depression, relatively common. And then I have chronic suicidal ideation, which is far more rare.
Hmm.
Chronic suicidal ideation, simply put, is suicide for me and for people in my tribe is always an option on the menu as a solution for problems large and small. And I tell the audience, when I say small, my car broke down a couple of years ago, and I had 3 thoughts unbidden. One, get it fixed. Two, buy a new one. Three, I could just kill myself. And it gets a giggle from the audience, but here's the upside of giving voice to that. I've discovered since 2014, there's been at least one person in the audience, sometimes more, who have chronic suicidal ideation. They do not know it has a name. They
Oh,
think they are just simply some kind of freak
yeah.
and completely alone. And a young woman come up at a college presentation. She said, "Thanks for your keynote." I said, "You're welcome." She said, "But I got to tell you, it made me weep." "How did it make you weep?" She said, "You know your story about the car, get it fixed, buy a new one, or kill yourself?" I go, "Yeah." She goes, "I've been having those thoughts all my life.
Mm,
I didn't know it had a name. I just thought I was some kind of freak and completely alone.
mm,
And when I heard you say that out loud, I realized for the first time in my life that I'm not alone, and I wept."
mm,
That has happened over and over. It's sort of like being George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life.
mm,
I've been shown what these people's lives might be like if I were not there to simply reassure them that A, it's a thing, B, they're not a freak, and C, they're not alone.
mm.
And if I died by suicide myself, then I would potentially take those people with me because they never had a chance for anybody to let them know, hey, you're not alone.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with us. You
Sure.
know, another thing that I think I see, at least in the medical and dental professional world, is there's a lot of shame around it. A lot of these very ambitious, success driven, highly achieving men and women who just can't seem to overcome this feeling of depression or suicide ideation. They can create empires, they can build enormous businesses, but this is a one aspect that they can't seem to conquer. How do you address that? Because I think having a recognition and seeing somebody who is experiencing something that you are, that helps. It gives you some resource that you're not alone in this world. But how do you then give them the support or the confidence to gain ownership of it?
Well, first thing we do is we talk about. I said, look, I've got good news. Dentists, physicians, not number one and two in the top 10 at-risk occupations for suicide. Bad news is you're solidly number five and six.
Mm,
The other piece of the puzzle is suicide is not the big killer of dentists, physicians, veterinarians, attorneys. What is the big killer is stress initiated or exacerbated mental and physical ailments. Physical ailments like high blood pressure, heart
mm,
disease, stroke, and of course, mental illness, depression, thoughts of suicide. So we talk about reducing stress, ways to reduce stress, self-care plan, gamification. That really is, and the stress in those occupations, those professional occupations, it it begins most often with financial stress because the
mm.
average dentist or veterinarian or physician these days comes out of school with anywhere from 350,000 to $500,000 in college loan debt
Oh, that's
before.
nothing, Frank. Much higher, I think, in some circumstances. Yeah.
And you have to open a practice. It's going to
Yeah.
cost you another quarter mil, half mil to open a, or buy into a practice or whatever. So that's where, and then so you're going in early, you're working through lunch, you're not going to the gym, you're not going home to be with your family when you should be.
Mm,
So it financial stress leads to physical stress
mm,
and mental stress, emotional stress, and so stress is the big killer in all those occupations.
yeah, absolutely. So, how have you managed to handle stress in your life?
I'm stoned. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I am in Oregon. It is legal.
Yeah.
Um, no, it's I think there. I in my third TEDx talk called "Mental with Benefits: The Evolutionary Advantages of Mental Illness." I kept bumping into people who had mental illness, were high functioning, and had some other
Mm,
amazing ability. Great writer, actor, comedian, whatever. And I thought to myself, this cannot be a coincidence. All these multi talented people also live with mental illness. And sure enough, if you look back in time, look and you do the research, you find that it is very common for super high achievers to have some sort of mental health challenge or other. And I realized that, and I said this to the audience, I do not believe I am broken. I believe I was made this way.
mm,
What if those of us living with a mental illness are not living with a genetic mutation, but an amazing evolutionary
mm,
adaptation? What if my comedic ability, creativity, and imagination are simply the flip side of my depression and thoughts of suicide. Same
mm,
brain, same wiring.
mm,
Just, I'm just not neurotypical. It's the whole idea of neurodiversity
mm,
in that I think differently. I can teach you to write stand up and perform stand up. I cannot teach you to process the
mm,
incoming information the way my brain does. And I do. So it's a curse and a blessing. Uh, Also, when I accepted that it's part of me, it's actually in my DNA. Somebody said to me, "How'd you choose suicide as a topic?" Well, you know what? The topic picked me because it runs in my family. It's not something I can get over. It can't be cured. It can be treated. I have a self care plan, diet, exercise, good night's sleep, meditation, medication, and some other things to daily practice to deal with it. And then my depression, major depressive disorder, lasts anywhere from 3 days to 3 weeks, depending on who you are. Mine lasts 3 days, 72 hours. I
mm,
start spiraling down the first day, flatten out the second, come back up the third. And it's not situational. I've been most depressed and suicidal at some of the best times in my life.
mm,
But having been through it so many times, I know when I begin to spiral down that 72 hours later I'll be flying level again. And I used to say I fight depression, but that's incorrect. Fight implies I can win. I can't win. I can lose and kill myself, or we can have a truce, uneasy truce like North and South Korea. Just live side by side. So I live with depression and thoughts of
mm,
suicide, and I don't fight it in that. There's a martial art called Aikido, and it's all about blending with your opponent's energy rather than
mm,
pushing back against it. You blend with it. So I try to blend with the energy of the depression
mm,
because it is a powerful force, not wasting the energy, pushing back against it.
mm.
So that's how I deal with it.
And it seems like that takes enormous awareness.
Yeah, I think the fact, and again, that's the beauty of my story about chronic suicidal ideation. Once somebody knows that's what's
Yeah.
going on,
Yeah.
once you name it, it empowers you.
Yeah.
Once you realize what you have is not who you are, but it is part of who you are.
Yeah.
And I think we should. The reason I did the mental health benefits was really for kids. What if we can convince kids that yes, you have a mental illness, but here's what they probably haven't told you yet. You may have a mental ableness or two or three that your peers cannot touch. So treat the mental illness, embrace, energize, wrap your arms around the mental abilities. If a kid's got OCD, why not steer them in the direction of a career where they value that, where attention to detail and precision is rewarded, like accounting, engineering, architecture? And a kid who's got, say, dyslexia, where the STEM programs, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, is nothing but letters and numbers rolling around the page. Why not humanities and such for a child like that? And then, and there are 30, according to 60 Minutes 2 years ago, there are at least 30 Fortune 500 companies hiring people on the autism spectrum for their singular ability and paying them handsomely. So the world has begun to realize that neurodiversity in the workplace can be a great thing, especially a lot of the tasks that somebody who on the spectrum can do and feel very comfortable doing are repetitive and would drive a neurotypical person crazy. But they find comfort in this repetitive, whatever it is, and they're really good at it.
Wow. I love that idea. I love that idea, especially for parents who are feeling stuck. They don't know how to support their children when they realize that they are struggling with something like OCD or any kind of neurodivergent concerns. I love the idea of harnessing it and trying to see how to work with it and to blend it into a superpower. What do you think is your superpower, Frank?
Well, on stage, it's vulnerability.
Mm,
Men don't tend to talk out loud about things that are emotional.
mm,
That's why 8 out of 10 people who die by suicide, or one of the reasons why 8 out of 10 people who die by suicide now are men. It's called toxic masculinity now. When I was a kid, it was called big boys don't cry, which I find
mm,
far more descriptive. And men tend not to reach out. And it's not just mental things. Men tend to wait too long to get a PSA test on the prostate or to get a
mm,
colonoscopy or they've got a lump in their testicle or they got chest pains and they don't go to the doctor or they just figure the chest pains must be a burrito. And so, but also with mental issues. Hardly any man that I'm aware of wakes up one morning and goes, I think I need to see a psychologist.
mm.
And when we did the books on each book we did is 12 stories, 12 men, their struggles. Life was good, then life went bad, then here's how I'm coping. And it seems with men, you almost have to drive them into a corner to get them into treatment. The wife or spouse has to say, look, I'm not going to put myself and the kids through this. You get help or we're leaving. We love you, but I can't. Or the boss says, look, Bob, if you don't get some help, don't come in Monday morning. We have a, EAP, Employment Assistance Program. Their mental health benefits. Go to HR and find out what they are. Get into treatment, or just, you're done. And the good news is, once a man is willing to go into treatment, generally they're all in, and they want to help other men. We thought we would get a dozen guys willing to tell their stories. We'd have one book. Well, we ended up with 48 or 50 guys with their
Wow.
stories, which became 1,000 pages. So we divided it into 4 books.
Wow. Wow.
So that's vulnerable. Seeing a man on stage crying or choked up, is I think is powerful, and again gives other men permission to give voice to their feelings and experience. I give my phone number out every time I speak myself. I say, look, if you're suicidal, call the hotline or text the text line, which is 741-741. If you're just having a bad day, call a crazy person. Here's my cell. And people call. When I did the gig in New York, it was 1,000 construction workers. I did 7 keynotes. We divided them into groups, and I gave out my phone number. At the end of my keynote, I say, look, we're going to do some general Q&A, and then after that, if you got an individual question, I'll answer all your individual questions. And so the next morning, I wake up, and the first text I got was a New York number. I'm in New York. It's a New York number I don't recognize. I open up the text, and it simply says, can I get that number again for help?
Mm.
So it's a guy who didn't want to ask the question in the general Q&A, didn't want to be seen talking to me afterwards individually, but reached out by text for help.
Mm.
And when I told that story at my next keynote, I got choked up because it's possible he may have saved a life. And I said to the audience, I guess big boys do cry.
Mm. Oh, I love that. I love that. I know that so many of my audience members who are listening to this today will hear what they need to hear today. And hopefully, your story has inspired them to share their vulnerability or their truth. And definitely, we'll put all the contacts in the show notes so that anybody who's listening to this episode, if they want to be able to find you, they can find you from
Mhm.
clicking on one of those links in the show notes. But for those of my audience members who are listening while they're driving, tell us how we can find you online.
Just type in the mental health comedian,
That's that
and
simple.
yeah, do that do it on any social media platform
Okay.
except Twitter, where they limit you to the number of characters. It's the MH comedian,
Okay.
but everywhere else it's the mental health comedian, and you'll find all my social media. You'll find my website, and on YouTube you can find my some of my TEDx talks.
TEDx Talks. And you also have something very special to offer to my audience members. You have a special CE course, workshop,
Yes, for
lecture.
yes, I have it's 1 to 3 hours of CE for dentists, for veterinarians. It could be CLE for attorneys, CME for physicians. I've done osteopaths, veterinarians, dentists, physicians, attorneys, agriculture. Because there are professional designations that you have to have a certain amount of CE for, or
Mhm.
CEUs, CMEs to get renewed. The state of Washington actually requires all people, everybody in the health professions, to have 3 hours of suicide prevention CE to renew their license.
Oh, I love that. Wow, that's great.
Yeah, hopefully that will over time spread to other states. Other states recommend it, but
Mm.
Washington passed legislation. You have to have 3 hours of suicide prevention CE. And you can get it from a clinician or a comedian. I mean, come on, which would you rather?
So, how do we access those? Also on your website.
Yeah, just contact me. It's the keynote is the same keynote. It's just I can expand it and give more information depending on how
Gotcha.
many hours of CE you'd like to have.
Gotcha. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here. And thank you for continuing to bring this important information to the world. And thank you for continuing to show up and to be vulnerable on stage. not an easy thing to do, and you do it so beautifully. You know, the way I found you was I heard you speaking at the Jumpstart 2022 with Vanessa, 2020. Yeah, we're in 2022 with Vanessa
Yes.
Emerson. And, you know, your presence is just so warm and welcoming, and you diffuse all those fears and anxieties in a heartbeat when you speak. And so I can just imagine that you do so beautifully live and in person as well. So I just want to honor you and say thank you. Thank you for doing the hard work.
Well, let's empower your audience before we leave. I've got a friend who says you need to make the audience the hero in the piece. So, 8 out of 10 people who are suicidal are ambivalent. 9
Mm,
out of 10 give hints in the last week leading up to an attempt,
mm,
which means we can save the vast majority of people. So, you can make a difference. You can save a life. And you can do it by doing something as easy as what we're doing right here, and that is starting the conversation.
mm. Well, there you have it. Thank you so much, Frank.
Yep, my pleasure.
And I hope you find two very happy puppies when you pick them up later this afternoon.
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, happiness and depression. People go, how can you be happy if you have depression? You know, they're two separate. I'm probably the happiest, most positive suicidal person you'll ever meet. So, you know, I'm not depressed 24/7, 365. I have more good days than bad, and I'm generally a happy guy. So, it's a different animal.
So,
Um,
what is your definition of happiness?
my definition is saving one life a day.
Wonderful. Thank you again, my friend. And thank you to all of you for joining us here today. You know where to find him. And please remember that when you feel good, you can do good. And if you can support those in need and start this conversation, we can save so many lives. Thank you so much.